These 7 letters that we're looking at in Revelation 2 and 3, I said this in week 1 of our series. These are like Jesus' Yelp reviews of the church. I'm probably going to say that every week because I want it to stick. These 7 letters are like Jesus' Yelp reviews of the church. This is the opinion that counts. Jesus' review of the churches are the ones that we need to pay attention to. When you look at reviews, you can tell what someone values. You can tell what is good and what is right. And so when Jesus gives his reviews, his critique, his evaluation of these 7 real historical churches, we need to pay attention to this, and we need to let this set our own evaluations for what church is. Last week we talked about the message or the letter written to Ephesus. Say amen if you remember last week's message. Amen. Talk about a heart-wrenching message. This is Jesus to the church. He says to Ephesus, you're moral and you're smart, but you've abandoned your first love. How do you respond to that? You've abandoned your first love. As a Christian, that cuts to the heart. You see, when it comes to these 7 churches, Jesus doesn't hold back, and I love it. And I said last week that each letter follows a certain pattern. There's a commendation, there's a rebuke, and then there's a promise. And what we're going to see is that this pattern applies more so 5 out of the 7 churches. That structure applies to 5 out of the 7 churches. So what about the 2 other churches? Well, one of those churches is Smyrna. And churches like Smyrna, we're not going to find any rebukes. We're not going to find harsh critiques. What we're going to find more than anything is an affirmation. Jesus' message to Smyrna is this: you're being faithful, and I want you to keep it up. You're being faithful in persecution, and I want you to keep it up. We're going to see the affirmation that Jesus gives. We're going to see the command that Jesus gives. And then we're going to see the promise that Jesus gives. So no rebuke. It's affirmation, command, and promise. Meet me at verse 9. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So take note of what Jesus says here to Smyrna. He says tribulation, poverty, and slander. He says, I know your tribulation, I know your poverty, and I know your slander. So I said this in week 1. The 7 churches here in Revelation are under heavy, heavy persecution. It was Emperor Nero who started the persecution, and when Nero died by committing suicide, Domitian took over, and he's now the new emperor. Now he's coming up with new and fresh and creative ways to persecute these Christians. This church in particular, the church in Smyrna, they're a little bit of in a unique position. In that area, there was a long-lasting and well-established Jewish gathering. And so for some reason or another, these group of Jews, they weren't under heavy persecution by the Roman government. They had somehow made peace with them. They were existing peacefully. They're existing in society. They're following the rules and the laws set by the Roman government. And so the Roman government saw that they weren't a threat. As long as they're law-abiding citizens, we're not going to bother them. They're a monotheistic religion. We'll leave them alone. Well, good for the Jewish gathering. But then what happens when in this Jewish gathering you have Jewish Christians? Not Orthodox, Old Testament straight-up Jews, but you have these New Testament Jewish Christians. And so what's going to happen then is that these old school, Old Testament, Orthodox Jews will look at these Jewish Christians and they'll say, you guys are being a little bit too radical in your faith. You're being a little bit too radical in this guy that you called Jesus, and you're going to get us all in trouble. We've made it well. We're doing well under the Roman Empire, under Domitian. He's not attacking us. But you're going to ruin it for all of us. And so what did the Jews do? They whistle blew. They told them the Roman government, and they said, these Jewish Christians are not real Jews. And so what did Domitian and what did the Roman Empire started doing? They started persecuting the Jewish Christians. That's what Jesus means when he talks about slander and he talks about poverty. Why poverty? Because when the Roman government starts to crack down on Jewish Christians, before he just catches them and throws them into boiling oil or whatever it is, they would start by cutting off their finances. They would create policies and laws where you couldn't work your job if you were a Jewish Christian. You'd be fired. If you were a business owner, they would shut down your business. They would do whatever it took to cut off your finances, because if your finances are cut off, well, then everything else in life is going to be that much more difficult. Maybe some of y'all have experienced that yourself. Maybe in your workplaces, you've been persecuted, you've been under a little bit of suffering because you wanted to follow Jesus and you wanted to obey. You didn't want to cut corners. And so the Roman government is now cutting off their finances, and that's why Jesus says, listen, I know your poverty. And this word in the Greek for poverty, it doesn't mean, oh, you have a hard time paying your bills. This is impoverished people. They're barely getting by. I wouldn't be surprised if they're homeless for the sake of following the gospel. Now, this is where the affirmation comes in. Jesus says, I know your tribulation, I know your poverty, I know your slander. Jesus says, I know. Do you guys remember when we had our retreat a few years back? We had it at Victory Ranch. Anybody? Just me? Okay, cool. So we had a retreat at Victory Ranch. It was one of our first retreats after we merged. And I had asked Pastor David Pack to come guest speak for us. A very soft-spoken guy, but everything he says is just so weighty and so meaningful. And one of the reasons I had him speak for us was because maybe some of y'all don't know this, but I had gone through some counseling with him. He counseled me, and I met with him for about a span of a year. I don't know, some of y'all are surprised. Pastors get counseling? Yeah, we need counseling more than you think. I had counseling with him for about a year, and so he knew very intimately the kind of struggles that I went through, the insecurities that I have, the kind of abandonment and isolation and loneliness issues that I was going through as a pastor in ministry. And so, and I'm just kind of laying it bare. I'm just kind of sharing everything, and he's there listening and caring and gospeling me and walking me through these struggles. And so I thought, man, it would be so awesome to have him come and share his wisdom and his insights at this retreat. And so I remember the last message with it was in a Sunday service, and we're sitting right here. I remember everything. And right before the worship team was about to go up, I'm getting ready and I'm excited, and he's going to give the last message, and he leans over to me and he says, I know how hard it is to be a pastor, but you're doing a good job and you're a good leader. And I looked at him and my eyes started welling up. Like, you're going to tell me this right before we start worship? Why are you telling me this now? That's all he said. And it was just this overwhelming sense of affirmation. That's all he said. This guy who has walked with me through my darkness pointed me to the goodness and love of Jesus, guest spoke for the people and the flock that I'm in charge of. All he says was, I know. I know how hard it is, but keep up in the faith. Keep up in the fight. You're doing a good job. Where the affirmation comes from makes a huge difference. Jesus starts his letter to the church of Smyrna with that. I know your tribulation. I know your poverty. I know the slander. Do you really, Jesus? Do you know? Do you know what slander is? Yeah, you remember a guy named Judas? Remember Peter denied me 3 times? You don't think I know what impoverishment is? Being separated from the Father? You don't think I know what tribulation is? Look at the cross. Jesus knows. And when the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings can look you in the eye, he can square you up, and he says, I know. Church, there's no greater affirmation than that. And that's how he starts his letter. So Jesus affirms the Smyrnians by saying, I know. I know what you're going through. And then he gives a command. We're looking at verse 10. 10a, to be specific, the first half, Jesus says, do not fear. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. So here's the command. Verse 10, he says, do not fear. Okay? Do not fear. Can we be honest? How in the world do you do that? How in the world are you going to walk out of church and just not fear? Seriously. I'm going to share with you a very interesting story. This happened a long time ago, and I feel like I can share this. I had a meeting at my house. I forgot what it was for, but I had some people over, church people were over, and we were having a meeting. And Karen happened to be there, and she went to the restroom to take care of her business. And I thought, okay, I'm going to troll her. I'm going to scare her. And so my restroom is right next to the laundry room, and it's dark. And so she's taking care of her business. I go into the laundry room, and I'm going to scare her. It's going to be funny, ha, ha, ha. She comes out of the restroom, and all I said was, Karen. She made a noise I've never heard before. I was going to show you a video clip of it, but that'd be like way too embarrassing. You can just check out my Instagram. But it was like, ah, ah, ah. It was like this weird noise, and I felt so bad, kind of. But it was just that picture was just so interesting to me. And so can we just thank Karen for being such a great sport? So let's analyze this, okay? Let's talk about this, okay? Why in the world did she get so scared? Right? What is fear? Right? She got scared because her expectation was that no one would be there. Why would they be? The pastor, of all people. Sorry. Why would anyone be there? No one would be. So her expectation was that no one would be there. She would walk away from the restroom, and she'd be fine. If she knew that someone was there, if she knew that I was there, she would walk out and she would just be like, I know, P-how, and then she would be fine. But because she thought, or her expectation was that no one would be there, her entire world got flipped upside down, and something was going to come out of the darkness and eat her alive. I don't know what she was thinking. See, fear is based on expectation. Fear is based on perspective. Let's get rid of the circumstances. Circumstances will be circumstances, will be circumstances. But it has everything to do with your perspective. This is just a random thought. I don't know if you've seen that new Jurassic Park movie, and they were kind of justifying the existence of dinosaurs, and they're calling them monsters. And then he says, well, a cat is a cat to us, but a cat is a monster to a rat. I was like, oh my gosh, that's like so profound. Perspective, right? Fear is based on perspective and expectations. So let me ask you then, okay? What is our expectation then? When it comes to the Christian life, what is our realistic expectation? What is our perspective about the kind of calling that God has given to us as believers? When you look at the Christian life, is suffering a part of that equation? Do you expect to go through suffering in your life as a Christian? Do you expect it? I believe that one of the ways that Satan attacks the American church today is that he gets next to you real close and real intimate, and he acts like he's your friend. He looks real pretty and real nice, and he gets close to your ear, and he says, you don't have to suffer. You really don't have to suffer. I hope you know that. He whispers into your ear, suffering is for the extreme Christians. Suffering is for the radical missionaries out in third world countries. You don't have to suffer. In fact, you're a hard-working American. You're educated. You're entitled to comfort. You want to suffer? Fine, be my guest. But the devil is saying, you don't have to suffer. Enjoy the blessings. and he'll twist Scripture, and he'll say, God is good, God is full of grace, God is loving, you don't have to suffer. And then that becomes our expectation. That becomes our perspective of the Christian life. You see, I think we take that lie and we mix it into the church and Christian experience, and the language that we use, the ongoing dialogue that we have in our heads is this, and I want you to listen to this very carefully. I think the dialogue and the conversation goes something like this. There's nothing wrong with you fill in the blank. There's nothing wrong with pursuing my dreams and letting nothing get in the way. There's nothing wrong with not sacrificing for the church financially. I'm young. What does the church expect me to do? There's nothing wrong with you fill in the blank. You see, the reason why that's so dangerous is because to an extent it's true. To an extent it's true. When you say there's nothing wrong with this, if you're practicing good theology, to a very large extent it's true. But the danger is that when that becomes our entire theology, when you say there's nothing wrong with this, and that becomes your entire Christian experience, that is the anthem and the banner over your head, and that is your picture of God, that's when comfort becomes your entire theology. That's when the Christian experience and the life that God has called you to becomes comfort is everything, and so when suffering becomes into the equation, something must be wrong. God must have changed his mind. God must not be blessing me. I must not be lucky compared to all the other Christians because I'm the one suffering. You feel me, church? That has everything to do with expectations. That has everything to do with perspective. If that's your perspective of the Christian life, this does not make sense to you. When Jesus says, do not fear, and your whole expectation is to live in comfort, you will constantly live in fear because suffering is not part of the equation. If you don't expect to suffer, you will be fear-driven as a Christian. You will wake up and go to sleep in fear. You will do relationships in fear. You will go to church in fear. You're denying it. I'm not living in fear, but it's that still small voice, isn't it? It's that thing you can't shake off. You're doing your QTs because you're in fear, because God's going to punish you if you don't. You're going to do the worship thing. You're going to serve because you're going to live in fear if you don't. So when it comes to the Christian life, what is God's perspective? Verse 9 uses the word tribulation. You see that? That word tribulation is used in the New Testament 37 times. 37 times. And almost every time it's used, it's always associated with suffering for Jesus, suffering in the end times, or suffering out of faithfulness. Meaning, it's not suffering for suffering's sake. Every time, out of the 37 times that it's used in the New Testament, tribulation is used somehow in suffering for the gospel. It's never pain out of your own fault. It's never used in the sense where you didn't study for your final exam and so you bomb the class, you have to retake it and you waste time and money and all that stuff. Oh, I'm suffering. No, that's your own fault. This kind of tribulation is a kind of suffering that is associated for suffering for the sake of Christ and the gospel and the kingdom advancement. Did you know? I didn't know this until I started preparing this. Every single New Testament letter, every single New Testament book carries somehow the idea of suffering and difficulty. Every single New Testament book talks about wrestling, facing difficulty, and struggling and being persecuted for the gospel. Every single book of the New Testament, it is in there. But in our American expectation, in our American perspective of Christianity, we see suffering and we go, that's for the extreme Christians, and we believe the lies of Satan. If you could sit down, New Testament, Matthew to Revelation, cover to cover, and go hunting and actually give an honest look at the theology of suffering, you will realize something profound that is against American Christianity. The call to follow Jesus is the call to suffer. The call to follow Jesus is the call to suffer. Listen to me. You are not the exception. You are not the exception. Just because you make a certain salary or you don't make a certain salary, you are not the exception because you are young. You are not the exception because of whatever it is you think it is. If you are a Christian, you're called to suffer. The sooner you can accept this truth, the sooner we can take heed to Jesus' command to not fear the impending suffering. I told myself I wouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Let's talk about Kobe Bryant. If you want to mourn his death and you want to pray for his family, go for it. As your leader on this platform, I'm not going to do that. And if you want to dialogue with me with that, that's fine. I have nothing against Kobe Bryant, but that's not how I want to steer this discussion. I'm open to sharing about that, but what I do want to talk about is let's look at his life for a second. Let's just examine his life. Before we get to his death, let's talk about his life. Kobe's life, Kobe lived the life that every guy wants to live. Let's be honest, man. I mean, he lived the life that every guy wants to live. Money. Who doesn't want money? Not only are you taken care of, but your kids are taken care of, and their kids are taken care of. You can go to sleep at night not worrying about finances. Your whole family and their families are going to be taken care of. He has two daughters, yeah? When they get married, their families will be taken care of. I mean, it's just nice to have money. Fame and respect. Who doesn't want fame and respect? You walk down the street, you go to a Starbucks, and you're treated like a king. I mean, this guy has 5 rings, a ring for every single finger. I would put that on first thing in the morning before I do my QT. Oh, here we go. 3, 4, 5. Right, here we go. And I'll show it off, bling it up. Oh, where'd my other ring go? Here it is, right? Just to make a point. Fame and respect. Skill. Who doesn't want the kind of skill this guy has? This guy can show up to any basketball court and light it up. Anybody in the world, even at his age. Listen to me. Security. Who doesn't want security? This isn't how he died, but in his lifetime, I don't know if you knew this, he lived in Newport Beach, and when he played games, he went to Staples Center. Instead of getting to a car, like the rest of us commoners, he rode a helicopter. Newport Beach to LA. Not because he's bougie, he is bougie, but he did that because the traffic from Newport Beach to Staples Center is a beast. Instead of wasting time on the freeway, he wanted to spend more time with his daughters and with his family. I think that's well worth the money if I had it. Right? That's like security. Right? And they say, I don't know if this is actually true, but they say that riding a helicopter from Newport Beach to LA is actually safer than riding a car. And then what happens? I want you to hear me when I say this. Death waits for no one. Death does not care who you are. Death does not care how many rings you have, how much money you have, or how moral you are. When death comes, it comes. Only God knows when that is. So what does that mean? It's about expectations. It's about perspectives. It's not about how you die. It's about how you live. Can we think about that in terms of the gospel? When we have the perspective that we're supposed to suffer, that we're gonna die, and there's nothing that you can really do at the end of the day to extend your life. I don't care how much kale you eat. I don't care how much you work out. When death comes, it comes. Doesn't that set our expectation and perspectives of how then we live this life for the King? These Christians in Smyrna are in a place where death is at their doorstep. Houses are being taken away, their finances, their jobs, everything is starting to crumble down. They've thought about death. They've accepted the reality of death. They've accepted the reality of their suffering. And the encouraging thing is, you know what? They're enduring it. Jesus is saying, keep it up. They're not running away. I've said this before, but this is a real church. A real letter written to a very real and historical church. The leader and pastor of the church in Smyrna was a guy named Polycarp. You can Wikipedia him if you want, Google him. Historical guy, church leader, trained and discipled by the Apostle John. He was a church leader, and as a church leader, he had to make definitive stands against the false religions and even the Roman government. They threatened to burn him alive if he didn't confess Caesar as Lord. And Polycarp said this. This is fire, man. You threaten me with a fire that burns for a season, and after a little while is quenched. But you're ignorant of the fire of everlasting punishment that is prepared for the wicked. Hot dang, dude. I'm getting fired up reading this. This is real. This isn't some C.S. Lewis quote. He really said this. Polycarp said, or they would say, why not confess Caesar as Lord? It's easier. Polycarp says, only Jesus Christ is Lord. 86 years have I served him, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king? And before he was about to die, he said, I bless you, Father, for judging me worthy of this hour, so that in the company of the martyrs I may share the cup of Christ. And he was burned at the stake. And he died so peacefully. They wanted to quicken his death, so they stabbed him until he would die. This is not metaphorical. This isn't hypothetical. This isn't some quote that some famous author like Tim Keller said. This is a real church pastor dying for the sake of the gospel. Can you imagine the kind of perspective and the kind of expectations that he had in life? That this life is not his? That to live is die and to die is gain? Can you imagine just the kind of perspective that he has, that suffering is on his doorstep, and not only does he accept it, but he invites it because it brings him to a deeper and richer fellowship with Christ. Okay? So all Christians are called to suffer. Every single New Testament book talks about it. Tribulation is mentioned 37 times. Why? Why would God want us to suffer? Verse 10, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. Tested. That you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. It might be helpful to know the 10 days mentioned here is most likely not literal. The 10 days most likely refers to the book of Daniel. 10 days refers to a testing period. And so when Jesus talks about 10 days, it's probably not a literal 10 days in jail. But it is a definitive moment in time. I want you to hear that. When you suffer for the sake of the gospel, it is not indefinite. It is a definite period of time. In my freshman year in high school, I went to Kennedy. Anyone go to Kennedy? All right, cool. A lot of pride in here. So I had a very interesting math teacher. He probably retired by the time some of you were in Kennedy, but his name was Mr. Bertoni. He's old and tired and retired. It doesn't matter. I can say his name. Mr. Bertoni. He had this thing called a mood-o-meter. He had a mood-o-meter. It was literally a thing he made, 3 moods. It was good, neutral, and bad. Literally. And this is what he would do. When the mood was here on good, little to no homework, no quiz, cheerful and good all day. When it was bad, lots of homework, pop quizzes and all that stuff, right? And we really thought that was a real thing, or we really thought he was just trying to be funny. You know, oh, his mood is good, his mood is bad. That's just his way of making things funny and getting us to get on board with what he's doing. And in the middle of the year, we were like, I don't think this guy's messing around. I really think that, like, this is really how he feels. And so me and a couple of my buddies were like, hey, let's give this a test. And so we walked into class, and I was like, Mr. Bertoni, first thing in the class, right? I started asking help for my homework, and I knew what was going on, and so you need to create a diversion. So I'm like, I need help. I'm being all dramatic. And so my friend sneaks behind him, and he changes the mood from bad to good, right? And so we started the class, and then Mr. Bertoni goes, okay, class, I'm in a bad mood. You're going to have a lot of homework. We're like, Mr. Bertoni, it says you're in a good mood. He goes, oh, okay, I'm in a good mood. No homework today. We're like, yeah! And so we're like, I can't believe this is actually happening. And then 2 weeks later, we got caught. But what happened was, that was a real thing he did. And so for like 3 weeks straight, he said, I'm in a bad mood. I'm in a bad mood. He kept saying that to get back to us. And during that period, and this is the worst part, every time, 30 seconds before the bell rings, he would say this. He would say, you might have a quiz tomorrow. Talk about cruel and unusual punishment. You might have a quiz tomorrow. I think half of us stayed up the whole night wondering if we should study. And then we would actually study. And then what ended up happening was, because he would say you might have a quiz tomorrow, we would all just end up studying, even if we didn't have a quiz, because we're just living in fear. And it ended up that we were one of the best performing classes of the entire freshman class, because we kept studying, because he kept being in a bad mood every day. Let me ask you something. Why does a teacher quiz? Why does a teacher give tests? You can show up to class and fake your class participation. You can do homework and fake it by copying. You feel me, church? You can't fake the final exam. Your body has to be there, and you have to take the test. And when Mr. Bertoni is in a bad mood and he's watching your every mood like a hawk, you can't fake it till you make it. That test will reveal what you really know. That test will reveal what you can't see from the outside. That's the point of a test. Why do you think God is testing you? You can't fake it till you make it in front of God. How do you want to know if you're a real Christian? You go through suffering and you still love God. God takes away someone you love. You can have your time of mourning and bitterness, but you still love God. God takes away your job. You're being faithful. You're following. You're obeying Jesus. He takes away your job. He takes away your salary. He takes away the nice things. He brings brokenness and darkness into your life, and you still love God. God tests because you cannot fake it till you make it with God. Jesus affirms the church by saying, I know what you've been through. Keep it up. And Jesus commands the church to not fear what they're going to suffer. Here's the promise. And it's a paradox. The promise here is a paradox. What is a paradox? It's a contradiction. Paradoxes are absurd because they're contradictions. They don't make sense. A wise fool. That's a paradox. Doesn't make sense. Bitter honey. Contradiction. Doesn't make sense. This statement is a lie. What? Doesn't make sense. Listen to me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Paradox. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Paradox. Listen to what Jesus says to Smyrna. I know your poverty, but you're rich. Verse 10, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you life. The crown of life. Contradictions are absurd. And because they're absurd, it only makes it easier for Satan to come alongside you and whisper in your ear, you don't need to suffer. You're entitled to comfort. How do we decipher truth from lies, especially in these weird paradoxes? Listen to me, church. The one who makes the promise is greater than the promise himself. The one who makes the promise is greater than the promise itself. This is how the author identifies himself. The first and the last who died and came to life. Jesus. Jesus. Jesus is the first and the last. Jesus is the one who died and resurrected. And this Jesus, who has gone through all things, is promising the church, embrace death so you can receive life. In other words, the sooner you let go of this life, the sooner you can start looking forward to heaven. In other words, Smyrna, be faithful. Be faithful and it will be worth it. In other words, life stream. Let go of this life. Let go of the comforts and it will be worth it. And he says, I know your tribulation. I know your poverty. I know the slander you've been through. I know. So do not fear. Do not fear. Set yourself a gospel-centered perspective and expectation of this life, and suffering will start to make sense. Death and life will start to make more sense. And I promise you, there is eternal life waiting for you if you will endure. Pray with me.